So, let's talk about Sagittarius. Everyone knows Sagittarius as fun, happy-go-lucky, sometimes called Sagittarius, but they're good people. We're also going to be learning about Jupiter, and of course, we'll be learning about the ninth house. So, if you were born between November 22nd and December 21st, you are a Sagittarian. That is also Sagittarius season, the time where basically we start to kind of get ready for fun. It does get a little bit chilly, but Sag season is very warm, loving, open-hearted type of energy, and it really is about wanting to feel um, connected. It is obviously the element of fire. It's very passionate. It is the last and most mature of the fire signs, and it's ruled by the planet Jupiter, which is seen as the symbol of the archer. It's really a man that's a centaur, half human, half horse. And like I said, it's very optimistic, open-minded, generous, and at its mature state, it is philosophical. At its most immature state, it is very pleasure-seeking. So let's talk about the adventure. So we can see Sagittarians as fearless explorers, but really they're just curious people that are willing to take the chance of learning and actually taking the experience to go through and test something, right? And that's where people see them as embracing new experiences. A Sagittarius person definitely wants to learn from their own experience, even if you tell them, right? And this is how you know the difference between a mature Sagittarian person, meaning like Stellium and Sagittarius, and one that isn't, is just if they'll actually listen to your advice. um, because they're truly here for an experience. That is the polarity between Gemini and Sagittarius. Gemini could just take it in and say, I have a lot of info. I'm not really doing much about it. And Sag is like, I don't have a lot of info, but I'm going to sure as hell do something to figure out and learn more about it. So they're definitely willing to take those risks. They're very optimistic because with the Sagittarius being ruled by Jupiter, it's always the glass is half full. We will always look for the brightness in situations and want to be upbeat, happy. Um, Negative challenges are rarely seen as an issue. It's more about like, oh, okay, now that there's a thing here, let's try a different way, right? I look at that optimism and I really think a lot about it with like the sextile to Aquarius, where it's very much like, hey, there's got to be another way. And then wanting to bring communion and the energy to be loving, like the aspect to Libra as well with that. They're very honest. Sometimes they can be a little too honest, but they're very honest because mentally there is no reason not to be. Because everything's such an experience that there's no fear of failure, there's no fear of loss. So that abundance really let them speak their mind. They're not really afraid of that. They're very direct and it does provide good clarity. If you really want some serious advice about something that's been bothering you, really go to a Sagittarian, right? And in the flip to that, it could be a little bit too straightforward, right? It can be a little bit too blunt because if we're just taking information in 24/7 and we're learning how to conversate and how to, in essence, convey words in a way to get the person that we're speaking to like us, which is really what Mercury wants to do, we think of Gemini. The opposite of Sag is really to get to the target. It's the arrow. It wants to actually impale what it's going after. So it's not going to be soft and docile. It's going to be very blunt to get to the root of the matter. And this can cause pretty much hurt feelings where they do come across insensitive, even though it might come from a good intention of a place, but it's like, hey, let's just get to it. With Sag, it is sometimes too focused on the destination, which what they should be doing is enjoying the journey. Whereas a Gemini will enjoy the journey but never want to get to the destination. Sagittarians can be a bit impatient because of this, as they're looking for a dopamine hit, and that's the excitement, and it can make them restless. It can make them not even easily bored, but it's like that threshold of dopamine. It's like they're looking for something to hit that fix when we think about that in a more biological sense. And lastly, the optimism can be a lot, and I'll dive deeper into that in regards to Jupiter and how it's a double-edged sword. It's a blessing and a curse in some instances because sometimes risk isn't really accounted for because you're so used to everything working out so fine that you really do push your luck. But speaking of Jupiter, let's talk about it. It is the planet of expansion. It is going to symbolize growth and abundance, but really looking at life with such a beautiful perspective, looking at life that we can savor, that there's more. And because of this, Jupiter is actually a masculine energy. It's very much an empire. It's a huge planet. And so it's less about what it is that is possible to me, but what it is that I want in the moment. And because of this, I look at Jupiter like a king that really just thinks to itself, well, I want this now, and then this. Sometimes I call it Santa Claus, because it truly never feels like it's going to run out. It rules Sagittarius and Pisces. Traditionally, it rules Pisces anyway. And it's looking for higher levels of philosophy, higher levels of enjoyment and learning when it's in Sagittarius. But on Pisces, it's always looking for spirituality and compassion and dreams. Now, when we do think about luck and good fortune, I just think of Jupiter. When people will ask me stuff about part of fortune, when people actually talk to me about part of fortune, I like to just tell them, oh, it's like a mini Jupiter. But instead of having to even try to manifest it, it just turns on whenever it's getting contacted, right? In your chart, I see Jupiter in many different places. I'll use it in the part of fortune, obviously Jupiter itself, some aspects to Venus, and then also some Neptune, where I'll kind of blend them all in. The house you have Sagittarius is important, and obviously, clearly, where you have Jupiter is important. This is really going to start a topic that I'm going to introduce. Because Jupiter is seen as higher learning and philosophy and wisdom, the pursuit of knowledge is expansive. Jupiter, it's kind of ironic because Mercury is seen as, I believe, it's like fallen um, in Sagittarius, but I really have a case to argue that it's just not organized in Sagittarius. Mercury in Gemini is constantly consuming energy, but the Mercury in Sag might not consume enough yet to act out on it in the most ethical way. And so when I look at that, I think the planet of Jupiter will give you wisdom, but it might not be the type of wisdom where you're like, I just immediately know this. It's more like the experience is accelerated with that because there is no bounds to this whenever you have that. Right now we have Venus in Sagittarius, right? Today is the 18th of October, 2024. Whenever you're watching this, Venus is in the first degree of Sag, while Jupiter is retrograded in Gemini. That's really big because Venus in Sag here is telling me that we're looking for an adventure. We're looking for a new horizon. And ironically, with this chart currently, we have Aries rising, so Sag is in the ninth house. We're learning about Sagittarius, kind of funny. The third house, Jupiter being in Gemini, we're now thinking about, okay, what are the small steps of Sagittarius that will allow us to fully understand it? Going through different PowerPoint slides, talking to you guys here one to one virtually. It's all coming together in that way. Aquarius is in the 11th house, which would be casual community. As I'm teaching this and bringing credence to Jupiter, you can kind of take that and say, we're getting the wisdom of this planet from Liv and how he's looking at it. This is where, in other instances of Jyotish, Jupiter is actually seen as the guru because you're learning from a knowledge and wisdom that might be bigger than yours, but you still have to experience it. And that's a really key part that I wanted to underline. We do see Jupiter as morals and ethics and justice because it wants the most abundant and good for people, that to some extent it will automatically be moral because it's like, well, if everyone can have it, we don't have to have limitations, and or we don't need to necessarily harm and hurt and wrong others because, well, everyone can have it. But then also from a moral standpoint of getting philosophy, it's just wrong to do that, right? And because Gemini is seen as short distance travel, mostly because it doesn't want to have to sustain such a long trip. It wants to do the everyday little thing near everywhere in a vicinity. Sagittarius is looking for the extreme, right? It wants to travel across the state, the globe. It wants to do something that is completely out of where it is at to really push that dopamine window. We do see spirituality and faith, and this is why sometimes I blend Sagittarius and Pisces together, or Jupiter and Neptune, because Neptune will show you media consumption. It'll really show you what it is that someone wants to digest in, you know, what it is that they want to completely absorb. That's like their religion. And so I like to look at where Jupiter is at and see aspects to it and see how a person lives a spiritual life or religious life in their faith. You have Jupiter in Sag and Neptune in Sag. Wow. Well, yeah, I'm happy that you're here and you actually made sure to come and attend this because that's a big one. Yeah. You have Sag in your 11th house, and that's a really big one. Um, oh no, you have Cancer rising. Okay. So then you have Sag in your 6th house. Okay. I'm happy you're here. We'll go after that. We'll go over that
Fifth
after.
house, I think it said.
Oh, okay.
Fifth and
Okay.
ninth house. I don't know if that's how it.
I'll double
I don't
check
know.
for you
Okay,
when I
thank.
pull it up. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So Jupiter is seen as exalted in Cancer. Although Sag doesn't have any exaltations, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer because it is able to just be so giving and nurturing. It is able to have limitless family and love. And in this way, Jupiter in Cancer to me seems almost also like Venus in Pisces in a way, or Neptune in Cancer. I haven't seen that in a while, but it's very much just free flowing, free giving. Just picture a beautiful community of people in a warm summer's day out in a field, maybe just enjoying nature, playing, an extended family that's huge. Generosity and benevolence is a part of Sag because of Jupiter's ability to say, I'm I'm like unstoppable. I can have anything I want, and therefore because I can always have it, I can always give as well, right? Now, the housing system itself, we talked about how if Aries is your rising house, you look to see where you actually have. Sagittarius specifically will always be the ninth house. But if your rising sign changes, you'll be looking to see, ironically, look at that, Cancer rising. um, you'll be looking to see if you have it at 0 to 10 degrees, it'll be perfectly the sixth house. If you have more degrees and you're using Placidius, it will be kind of probably playing into more of the fifth house in that way. And you want to look to see if you have it digging more, it could be the seventh. So that's very important because Sagittarius in the sixth house is all about everyday abundance, everyday spiritual growth, everyday learning, constantly trying to achieve more because it's Sag is in your sixth. So your everyday routines have to grow you. It has to be some sort of seed that is getting grown. And so when we actually do talk about that ninth house, it associates with everything that we've learned. However, instead of just considering Jupiter or Sag, I want to now look at it from the lens of the planet that's there, right? The planet that's there will always express itself in abundance, but this can start to become something to kind of worry about because the planets are not comfortable or they're not, let's just say, acquainted with how much Jupiter can truly expand, right? Jupiter is a planet that knows itself at least to keep going. But when you have Sagittarius, the sign in Venus, maybe it doesn't know how to stop itself from the desires that it wants, right? If you have it in Mars, maybe it doesn't know how to stop conquest. And Mercury, maybe it doesn't know how to stop speaking, stop learning. Um, this is something to consider because, like I said, if we know with what I mentioned, Jupiter is all about abundance. You can always go up and learn more. How much is too much, right? Jupiter doesn't stop, it is limitless. But in order to tame Jupiter, we have Saturn. And I'm starting to give into the idea that Saturn is feminine, mostly because if Jupiter is seen as masculine, it's always looking to achieve, accomplish something. And so Saturn being an older feminine, maybe a sort of like grandmother figure, it comes in to balance Jupiter to say, hey, stop. Like, you're trying to reach for the moon, but let's stop. And I think about this in retrospect to how Jupiter is always going to increase. But when you have Saturn and Jupiter in our economy, it always causes a bit of a retracement. But to me, it just comes across as a rebalance. It's more of like, hey, we've been expanding for so long. Let's try to retract and see if this is really feasible and manageable. So definitely keep that in mind because if you have, let's just say, Moon in Sagittarius or Moon in the ninth house, that association will really make you look at, hey, what are my ethics and morals in this? What is it that I like to learn? What is it that I like to pursue spiritually? But also, am I able to ever be content? Right? A moon in Sag in the seventh house might not be able to just stay with one person, given their chart has other aspects that is controlling that Jupiter. But if not, then they're always looking for the next possible opportunity. A Mars in Sag in the first is definitely not going to be able to sit down. Someone like that, I'd say, hey, maybe you want to try doing a martial art because that way you can control it. In the same respects, fire signs trining that Sagittarius placement as well could also be a very lethal thing, especially Aries. Aries trines to Sagittarius energy is like two workouts a day at the minimum. They're playing in traffic because they just cannot contain themselves. They don't know how to. And so I typically tend to see Sagittarius heavy people end up very reckless early on in youth because now you factor in the fact that you're literally young, you're not fully mentally developed, and also, well, no one's expecting you to do some of these things. And so you're really pushing yourself because if Sagittarius is that masculine energy, Jupiter is that masculine energy and is trying to accomplish so much more, when does it know when to stop? Probably when it gets knocked down. And so our society might not really conform to this because they might not have the opportunity to just get a pat on the wrist or something like that. Whereas if you have, let's just entertain Mercury again, and you have Sag and Mercury in the 12th, that could be a really strong spiritual steroid because now you're trying to transverse through the subconscious, and I see that in terms of manifesting, quite literally speaking things into existence, because with Mercury having a direct access to the 12th house, especially if it's not retrograded, it will be able to say, this is what I want, and then it happens. It would really feel a lot like synchronicities. Having Sun and Sagittarius in the fourth house would make the home become the ideal place to grow. Ironically, retrograded, it always seems to produce homebodies because it's like, why would they want to leave their home? That's where they find their sense of expansion. And so the house that does have Sagittarius, you really want to see where it does find its quest for meaning and truth. Um, the ninth house specifically would look for that search for meaning. But if you have a lot of planets in Sagittarius and you put it into that house, that's going to be the sense of like, I need to do this. One really big instance is like if there's a Virgo rising, the fourth house is Sag, there's no retrograded planets in that fourth house, and Saturn in Sag is not there. Then if they have Uranus or Jupiter, really anything, especially North Node, they'll end up being people that are writers, while consequently at the same time, they're looking to travel the world to find their true home family, right? If it's retrograded, they'll just stay at home and really try to connect with people virtually because the 10th house is Gemini. And so they're constantly looking for a new sense of source. But it's really interesting. So I would definitely implore you to look at the house that you have Sagittarius and do some investigating to see where it is that you'll find a really deep passion as you get older. Because once the Sagittarius does start to get older, they become so wise, like so wise. They have a lot of things to say. They've experienced a lot, but when they are able to sit down and really focus that energy on learning, they know exactly what to say. And with that, they also know how to manifest. They end up becoming people that aren't really so attached to material desires because the dopamine of that object no longer really fuels their needs. They're like, yeah, I could buy that, but I've already done that. I've done that. So it's like a Sagittarian either has to exhaust all their dopamine in the world before they decide to say, all right, I don't really need more of this, and then basically become a better version of a hermit, someone who actually takes knowledge and travels, maybe a gypsy, and really just sits there and enjoys life, really just experiences everything to its fullest because they're like, this is really what matters: experience, love, and enjoyment. So, with that, I'm going to cover the domicile, exaltation, detriment, and fall of Sagittarius itself. As I've said many times, domicile is basically where the planet wants to be. It's like its home base. The detriment is where it does have a disability to actually regulate that energy and therefore it's conflicted or weakened. In the exaltation, this is where a sign is at its best. It's able to wield its true power and not really have to think twice. And hopefully it's in a positive way. In its fall, it's where it's kind of weakened, but in this case, it's not as effective and it's more of a challenge to itself on its own than it is overall. You can have fallen detrimental planets and have it work so good for you in your chart because maybe you have too much in other places and that balances you out. Then you can have a lot of exaltations and domiciles that really you shouldn't have had because it indulged you too much. So, when we do talk about Sagittarius, its domicile is, of course, Jupiter. Sagittarius wants to be in Jupiter. It feels at home. It's so optimistic. It's so expansive. It becomes philosophical. And with everything that we covered, it's basically a lot of growth. It's wisdom. And it's able to experience life to its fullest. The detriment, which is what I said was earlier, where I said it's Mercury, but sometimes I can have a disagreement with that depending on the chart. The detriment is Mercury. And that's because Mercury rules communication and detailed thinking. Because Sagittarius is so grand and expansive, Jupiter, it is more concerned with the bigger, broader picture. It doesn't really want to actually look into the short, small details. It wants to just make it work. And for that reason, this is where we see in the mutable square, Sagittarius squares Virgo, but then it opposes Gemini because Gemini might not actually get the action started, whereas Virgo will take action, but it wants to be perfect. So Virgo's halfway between Sagittarius and Gemini for that reason. Because if we're starting here and we're saying, I'm going to think too much, and then, okay, I'm going to try to think a lot and maybe think a little bit less and be perfect. And then it's like, all right, well, we'll just see what happens. That's what ends up becoming Sagittarius. It's like, we'll see what happens. I've thought a lot, but hey, I forget something, we'll improvise. And so, last but not least, Pisces is like, I'm not thinking at all, but that's for another day. Mercury doesn't want to be in that state. It wants to be able to travel and know everything exactly as possible. There is no exaltation for Sag to be in, and I think that's pretty fair, personally. Jupiter is the biggest one. It's the most benevolent, so I think it's doing pretty good there. And there's also no fall of where Sagittarius is to be in. Now, I've covered everything overall, and I'm going to take some time and you guys can ask me questions. We'll stop the video because we covered a lot of this, but I wanted to give you guys a bit of time to go ahead and cover everything. But if you're watching and you do have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be able to respond and go over stuff. But yeah, thank you for watching and take care.